Good day, everybody. It's the Bible in a Year 2021. We're on day 84, and we're going to be looking at Joshua chapter 9 to 11 today. We get into a lot of the conquering of the land today. And just bang, right at the beginning here, let's just take note again of Yahweh's methodology here. In verse 1, all the kings on the west side of the Jordan heard about this, including those in the highlands, the lowlands, and along the entire coast of the Mediterranean Sea toward Lebanon. They were Hittites and Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. So what's happened is that everything that has Yahweh's been doing through the Israelites has struck fear in all the surrounding kingdoms and cities and such, and they're scared, and we're going to have them coming together here to attack Israel. But this whole thing is Israel is provoking. It's provoking this thing, and that's what the Lord wants. He wants them all to be provoked so that they can run headlong into their death, basically. And then we have Gibeon in verse 6. Gibeon is an interesting lesson here. The Gibeonites, you know, they're deceptive, but they were clever. Their deception wasn't to be held up. It's not that. But let's just look at this for a second, and we'll see what we can take from this. So just here, they went to Joshua at the camp at Gilgal. They said to him and to Israel, "We have come from a distant country, so now make a treaty with us." They haven't come from a distant country. They've come from over the hill. They've just made everything appear looking like they've come from a long way. And so they have this deception. This is our bread. On the day we left to come to you, we took it warm from our houses as supplies, which they didn't. They took the oldest bread that they could find in their city, and they packed it in the bag to make it look like they've been on the road for a long time. But now here it is, dried up and crumbly. So what is this telling us? This is telling us the Gibeonites looked at this, they evaluated this, they saw that here this royal city of Jericho has fallen. The first one, bang, big city, gone. And they see what's happened to Ai, and they think, no, 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 no. We can't win this. We're not going to do this by might. We're not going to do this by our effort. So the best chance that we have, because we can't win, is to use deception. And you remember that this was a tactic that was used previous when Balaam's couldn't get around to cursing Israel because he couldn't curse them. He worked it out that maybe they could deceive them. So that had already been tried. But here the Gibeonites, they succeed because Joshua is new as a leader and he hasn't caught on yet. He hasn't caught on that even though he may be leader, it is Yahweh who is the leader. Yahweh is overall, and he, as the leader, needs to be consulting with Yahweh, and he hasn't been doing it, and so he keeps messing up. And this is part of his continuing failure here. The Israelites took some of their supplies, but they didn't ask for any decision from the Lord. Underline it. They thought they were being smart by checking the supplies, but they were deceived because they didn't ask the one who knows everything. Yeah, Yahweh makes room for us to make our own mistakes. Joshua made peace with them. He made a treaty with them to protect their lives. The leaders of the community made a solemn pledge to them. So it wasn't just a treaty, we're not going to attack you, but it was a treaty, hey, we'll come to your aid when you're in trouble. And it was a solemn pledge. Got to remember that. Remember, if you remember back when the law was being given, there's a whole thing on oaths and solemn pledges, and Yahweh takes this very seriously. Keeping your word is a very serious thing for our Father. He's a keeper of promises. And so they find out, right? They find out that they've been deceived by the Gibeonites. They go to Gibeon, all upset, and it's like, hey, why did you do this? The Gibeonites say, hey, we didn't want to die. We did this because we didn't want you to kill us. It makes, from the Gibeonites' point of view, this makes absolutely 100% total sense. Okay. They may end up having to be slaves and servants, which is what's about to happen to them. But as far as the Gibeonites are concerned, we'd rather be servants and alive than to be free men and dead. That's their thinking, which really goes against some thinking that is prevalent in our time, that it would be better to die a free man than to be alive and a slave. The only problem with this is that once you're dead, you're dead. And there's always hope as long as you're alive. As long as there's life, there is hope. Can you imagine if the Israelites in Egypt had decided that it would be better for them all to be dead, than to continue the way that they were going? And we see many cases that it's people held onto hope as they're going through. We seem to be a people who have a tough time with hope. We have medical assisted suicide now because people don't see any hope. Because they see no hope, they'd rather just die. We have a generation that is being raised that is missing that element of hope. They see no hope. And they don't understand that things change. Just because it looks this way right now doesn't mean it's always going to be this way. There's a lack of wisdom from experience to understand that things change. Nothing stays the same. So here we see that Yahweh's perfect plan starts to unravel because everybody's supposed to be dead. Everybody's supposed to be wiped out. In verse 18, we read, but the Israelites didn't strike at them. This was because the leaders of the community had made a solemn pledge to them by the Lord, the God of Israel. The entire community grumbled against the leaders because of their lack of wisdom. But they had to honor this pledge. They had to. That was in their law. That was absolutely vital that they keep their word, even though we have this problem here that Yahweh's purpose was for these nations to be wiped out, not one person staying alive. And at the same time, we have his law that says you have to keep your solemn pledges. And the solemn pledges wins out over this other thing. It's just that's how important it is. That's how important keeping your word is. That's where he values it. He did not give them permission to wipe out the Gibeonites because of the solemn pledge. So that day, in verse 27, that day Joshua assigned them as woodcutters and water haulers for the community and for the Lord's altar, located wherever God would choose. That is still the case today. And yeah, the Gibeonites plan worked. They lived, and all their neighbors will end up being killed. In chapter 10, verse 4, now the problem is the Gibeonites are seen as traitors by the rest of the Canaanite nations. And they're panicked. They look and they see that Jericho has fallen, Ai has fallen, and the Gibeonites, which is a large city, they have made a treaty, and so the one king calls all the others together and says, "Come on, come up and help me. We will strike at Gibeon." Because it has made peace with Joshua and with the Israelites. You can understand that, can't you? If you're in this coalition and one of them goes over to the enemy just to save their own neck. And here we're in this awkward situation now where Joshua ends up defending his enemy. In verse 7, so Joshua went up from Gilgal with the entire army and all the bravest soldiers. And they had to go to war against these kings, which they're going to get around to doing eventually. But these kings were provoked because of what the Gibeonites did. And so Joshua ends up taking them on. And we end up with some phenomenal stuff out of this. And in verse 10, and I want you to notice this and how often it comes, we have the situation where it's a mammoth army. I'm talking mammoth, okay? Israel is nothing compared to this army. And but we have this. Then the Lord. Yeah. Then the Lord. How many times does that happen? Then the Lord. Impossible situation. Then the Lord. They couldn't do anything. Then the Lord. They didn't know what to do. Then the Lord. Look at this. Then the Lord threw them into a panic before Israel. That's this mammoth coalition of army here. Joshua struck a mighty blow against them at Gibeon. He chased them on the way up to Beth Horon and struck them down as far as Azekah and Makkedah. And then we have again the Lord, when they were fleeing from Israel, were on the slope of Beth Horon. The Lord threw down large stones from the sky all the way to Azekah. So they died. In fact, more died from the hailstones than the Israelites killed with the sword. So who does the victory belong to? Hmm? Yeah. And then we have this incredible moment here. It's a supernatural invention in intervention in verse 13. Isn't this written in a Jashar scroll? So the sun stood motionless in the middle of the sky. For a whole day, it was in no hurry to go down because this is a huge army. It's a lot of people. They can't destroy this army quickly because there's just so many of them. Here, this tiny army of Israel needs more time, and more time is given to them to absolutely wipe out this huge thing. And what's amazing, look at this. This is all over a solemn pledge. This is all because of a solemn pledge to an enemy that had deceived them. Now, we know that if we had entered into an agreement and it was proven that the person we entered into agreement with or the company we entered into agreement with had deceived us, that agreement would be null and void. There would be refunds, the whole bit. There might even be fines from the courts and all that sort of stuff. But it didn't matter that they were deceived. They had given a solemn promise, and that solemn promise stood. And as a result, we have, look what this says in verse 14. There hasn't been a day like it before or since. There hasn't been a day like it before or since when the Lord responded to a human voice. The Lord fought for Israel. This incredible moment over this solemn pledge. And then Joshua turns around and he uses this as an object lesson in verse 25. Then Joshua said to them, don't be afraid or terrified. Be brave and strong, because this is how the Lord will deal with all the enemies you fight. Because they're just at the beginning. They've got a lot of territory that they have to cover. They're going to come in this great way, and then in a mammoth army, they're going to stop, and then they're going to break up into their groups and into the tribes, and then each tribe is going to have to then fight in their own area. Um, and we have this. Look, these kings were killed. So why bother hanging them on a tree, right? Because that's what we read in verse 26. Next, Joshua struck them down. He put them to death and then hanged them on 5 trees. They were hanging on the trees until evening. And the reason is because this is how um, it was written in the law. Whoever is hung on the tree is cursed by God. And these kings represented these nations, these peoples, and they were hung up there so that they could be cursed of God, because that's exactly what they were. These were cursed people. They were to be destroyed, and this was a very significant um, thing, spiritual thing that was being done. This hanging on the tree was a spiritual matter. And then verse 40, we really get the impression that this was fast and hard and thorough. So Joshua struck at the whole land, the highlands, the arid southern plains, the lowlands, the slopes, and all their kings. He left no survivors. He wiped out everything that breathed as something reserved for God, exactly as the Lord, the God of Israel, had commanded. Exactly, in obedience. And in verse 42, Joshua captured all these kings and their land all at the same time. This was because the Lord, the God of Israel, fought for Israel. How many times are we going to read it? How many times is it going to be written? But they want Yahweh to receive the glory for this because they recognize that they themselves could not have done this. These were mighty, mighty, mighty kings and warriors and armies that they were going up against. And man, they weren't trained warriors. They, they were a generation that came out of the desert. They didn't fight anybody. They had no training, but they were gaining experience. But it was the Lord who was fighting for them, and that's to be noted. Then in this last chapter for today, um, just again to recognize that the Gibeonites appear to be the smartest. In verse 6, the Lord said to Joshua, "Don't be afraid of them. By this time tomorrow, I will make them all dead bodies in Israel's presence, cripple their horses, burn their chariots." And and when you look at it, when you look at this massive destruction that is going on, and you stop and you consider one city has survived, one city, and it's because uh, they knew that they couldn't fight, and so they did whatever they could in order to survive. Hmm, interesting. And then again, recognizing when to give the credit all to the Lord gave them into Israel's power. So again, this massive army, the Lord gave them into Israel's power. The Lord gave them. They struck them down. They chased them as far as Great Sidon and um, Mizrephoth Mem, and then to the east as far as the Innisbay valley. They struck them down until no survivors were left. And it's because the Lord gave them into Israel's power. And we need to stop and recognize here. We don't need to, but I want to stop and recognize here Joshua. Um, it started off rough. His mistake at Ai, his mistake with the Gibeonites, it really started off rough. But after that, it seemed that Joshua had really learned his lesson well. There was no more gaffes at all. There's no more mistakes, and we can. It says that he followed all the instructions, right? In verse 15, what the Lord had commanded Moses, his servant, Moses had commanded Joshua, and Joshua did exactly that. He didn't deviate a bit from any command that the Lord had given Moses. Because you remember, this invasion was all planned before they came into the land. It was all laid out. It was Joshua who was carrying it out. And at the beginning, there was a couple of hiccups, but after that point, he moved in and he did exactly what was told to him. And the Lord kept encouraging him and giving them the signs and fighting on their behalf. And this they ended off just with this one verse, the summary, where it says they're referring to the people in the land. Their stubborn resistance came from the Lord and led them to wage war against Israel. Israel was then able to wipe them out as something reserved for God without showing them any mercy. This was exactly what the Lord had commanded Moses. And as hard as it is to read, and it should be hard for us to read about these civilizations, these cities, these kingdoms falling and being destroyed with not one person left, we got to remember that they were considered guilty um, in the Creator's eyes. They were considered guilty because what they have done with worship, and because of what they were doing to their children in worship, and the other really terrible things that had come out of this idol worship, and there wasn't any wickedness left for them to do. They had done everything that you could possibly do, and so that's why they were being removed. We can't forget that. that the Lord is righteous in his judgment. We have to remember that he is righteous in his judgment. I am so thankful that his judgment has been stayed until one day, until that day of judgment. And I'm so thankful this is an age of grace. And I'm so thankful that he has given humanity time to turn around, to turn to him. But when that day comes, and it will come swiftly, and it will be complete, and there will be a lot of weeping and gnashing of teeth, according to what Jesus has taught us. So keep that in mind. Okay, so guys, be blessed. Have a fantastic day today, and tune in tomorrow as we continue this journey with Joshua. God bless.